Rolling.
So unfortunately, the change of day seemed to have changed quite a few of the participants as well. Um, and that's both good and bad. But the last time we discussed the proposal process, which is our one of our top priorities that we're trying to accelerate. Caleb was kind enough to draft something inspired by the Rust RFC process. Where we ended last time was with my comment, which is the last comment on that proposal. Let me just paste that into the chat. Community PR 967 is we're going to split it into multiple pieces to make independent progress. The reorganization of the design proposals directory, starting with an attempt to categorize existing docs to determine whether categorization by SIG or some coarser area bucketing made the most sense. Clayton had volunteered to do that. I haven't seen any movement on that. Paul Morey, I think, had previously volunteered to take a whack at the proposal process before Caleb's PR, but I didn't see anything out of Paul either. There were already a couple of requests to standardize the metadata attached to each proposal document, and I think that's a relatively simple thing that could be figured out, like just simple stuff like when was this last updated, what is the current status, is it a draft, was it accepted, is it implemented, is it alpha, beta, GA, what is it? So people can tell the difference between half-baked things and more fully baked things. The rest of the proposal template, which has a bunch of concrete things. We took a stab, Phil Whitrock took a stab at some of this with respect to API reviews as well. There's a lot of overlap, and eventually I want to merge those. And this PR has a number of reasonable proposed sections as a starting point. Let me just see if I can find it in the midst of all the comments. No, it's hard to read with all the comments. I can turn the comments off. Oh, here. What SIGs, things like what SIGs are responsible, summary, motivation, examples, detailed design, graduation criteria, drawbacks, alternatives, unresolved questions. And those are standard design doc proposal kinds of things that I'm sure many people have seen in proposals from many of their previous projects. I think there are a few additional things which are super critical, like which themselves will need to discuss what the process is, like how to actually identify who the approvers and reviewers are so that the person responding to feedback can distinguish feedback that needs to be resolved from just feedback from participants that needs to be taken into consideration. Ultimately we'll want to connect this to the feature development process, although I view the template as a separable thing from the process as a whole. So that was I think the last bit I suggested peeling off. And the communication procedure, like who should get notified, how should they be notified, how do we want to do that? Do we want to have a single proposal list that all the proposals get copied to with a link to the proposal, and then the discussion happens all in the actual proposals? Are the GitHub teams I created a reasonable way to go? And then people interested in proposals in several SIGs can subscribe to those, either subscribe to the Google Group mirrors or to the GitHub teams. I think these are a bunch of separable pieces that we can attack independently, so we can start actually making some progress instead of trying to boil the whole ocean in a monolithic way. I'd like to get owners assigned to each of these things, owners who will actually work on them. Clayton is super duper busy, so I don't know if someone else wants to take a stab. um, at the categorizing the existing proposals. But it'd be good to make some headway on this. Anybody else have some thoughts, opinions, want to volunteer?
I agree that we can split out
hey, Caleb.
Hey, Bren. Sorry, I dropped in late here. Yes, that we can split out the actual template for the process and communication regarding a new proposal process. I want to try and get some time with Jace next week. He's got some great thoughts about how to facilitate a planning process, and so I want to figure out how to integrate an updated template in that process. I imagine there's going to be 3-ish probably primary ways of proposing a new change enhancement. One would be a large-scale planning process where we have, SIG lead, whether that's the facilitation SIG lead or the technical SIG lead, all together, so we can look at large technical projects that would have been proposed and staffed or driven by SIG Architecture or SIG Release, one of the large cross-cutting SIGs, so we could produce some kind of roadmap and get everyone on the same page. There also, I imagine, there's going to be a process that the SIGs will manage themselves for tracking their own more limited technical agenda. And then there's the how to get general community, like a community member who's not necessarily associated with any SIG, to get their proposal through and merged. And so I think starting with that framework, I'm going, Jason, time permitting, Jason and I can try putting some thoughts there about how an RFC would go through. So, with those 3 starts.
Yeah, totally happy to do that with you, Caleb. That's great.
Yeah, that sounds like a good categorization of scenarios anyway. It's not clear to me that they're radically different processes necessarily, but one thing I was thinking is, as part of the kind of there needs to be some sort of discovery process about figuring out where does this proposal belong. Because a proposal might start in a particular SIG or in no SIG, like in the case of a new contributor, although one could question whether a new contributor should really be doing anything hugely significant. But there might be an escalation process. If someone says, SIG release really needs to review this, or SIG testing really needs to review it, or SIG architecture really needs to review it, even if it started in, say, API machinery or SIG network or something like that.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that's where Joe's suggestion to look at the Python PEP process will be helpful. I think certainly, at least for the beginning, we'll probably need dedicated people to help with the routing and the triage. PEP's got editors that are focused on ensuring the process moves smoothly. I think we need a similar kind of community facilitation role.
Okay. So did you want to split the template sketch into a separate PR, or would you like another volunteer to do that? I think the sections you suggested are a good starting point. I just like a little text, boilerplate text for each one explaining what it is, and maybe we can quickly iterate and add a couple of things that need to be added and get that merged and iterate further on that.
Yeah, that sounds good. I can take that.
Cool.
Is part of that process to create those top-level directories for each SIG in your mind, Brian? So basically populate the repos with the directory tree and all that stuff, or is it just to get the template?
Well, that specific thing I was talking about is just the template. I think categorization of the existing proposals and reorganizing them is a separate item. If you, I can paste a link to the comment. My suggested breakdown was here. Which is, I can paste that in if I can paste it in.
Got it. Yeah.
someone can just create a doc or a spreadsheet, just do ls-1 on the directory as it stands and try to bucket each one into a SIG or something and see if we believe that approach holds up, or how many would be, if we need a umbrella bucket for hugely cross-cutting things, we could have that also. I'm a tree person. Huh. Is that purely?
That's purely a joke.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, so I think as one thing, wearing my governance hat, in terms of structuring the project, I think we'll need to have, in addition to SIGs, we'll need to have an official notion of sub-project that is finer grained than SIG. And that may well impact the design proposal structure as well. So just as a simple example, in SIG apps, we have Helm, which isn't in Kubernetes, so, and it's fairly independent, so maybe it's not covered by this, but just as an example. And then we have the workload controllers. Or in SIG network, which is maybe a better example, there's pod networking, there's service networking, there's ingress, there's network policy. There are at least 4 or 5 distinct sub-projects, and there's some overlap in expertise and a little bit of overlap in people, and DNS. But the components are largely independent, and the API surface is largely independent. So I view those as could be declared to be like distinct sub-projects that have their own approvers and things like that.
And this is Matt Farina here from SIG Apps, and I kind of like the idea of using Helm as a thing because they have had to set up a little bit of their own structure, and so they could serve as a good template because it's working.
Yeah, in one direction I'm going there, partly because it's so big and partly because of its position in my layer stack of being out in the ecosystem, at least the way it's currently factored its functionality. I created a GitHub org for Helm, and I envision multiple pieces of Helm, such as the main lifecycle driver tool, the Go template mechanism, if that is broken out into a separate tool like I would like. Monocular could all go into that separate GitHub org. They have their own separate releases and things like that, so that seems like a reasonable way to go. Lets them get, like, one issue they've had is that they don't have any org owners, so they can't add members to the org, and if you can't add members to the org, you can't add them to teams. So they've just been adding outside collaborators directly to their repos, which more or less works permissions-wise, but they would have more autonomy in a separate GitHub org.
Well, a question at some point becomes, and this speaks to your architecture model about Nucleus versus the rest, is when we talk about things like Helm, are we actually talking about Kubernetes anymore? Are we talking about the ecosystem?
So I wear a lot of hats. So with my CNCF hat,
right.
The issue that Node.js has with respect to this is that they actually structured the foundation so they have multiple top-level projects. But in practice, there are only 2, which is Node and Express. And they decided they're not going to take other projects in the space as at least a de facto position. So they direct most kind of user space or ecosystem, what we call ecosystem projects, to the JavaScript foundation. So they get pushed into a completely separate foundation, even though they're really just for Node.js. I don't really like that solution for us. I don't see a Kubernetes specific tool like Helm ever being a top level project in CNCF. CNCF is more intended to be more broad than just Kubernetes. It's cloud native systems in general, and we want them to work well with Kubernetes, but they're not necessarily only for Kubernetes. Like if you look at Prometheus or Linkerd, you can use them outside of Kubernetes, right? So, but I do want a home for ecosystem projects, and the Kubernetes project, I think, is big enough to host some of those projects. I do think, ultimately most of the development, and this is probably already true, that most of the development is going to be in the ecosystem and non-foundation owned repos. That's a healthy thing, in my opinion. That's the only way it's really going to scale to massive levels and produce lots of opportunity for businesses to innovate and things like that. But where there are kind of substantial things that are broadly useful for lots of people in the ecosystem, we are going to need a process for taking on those kind of projects. And we've taken several already. We've taken Helm, we've taken Kubernetes Anywhere, we've taken Cargo. So at some point, I'll want to formalize that, both in terms of the process for onboarding those kinds of projects and for how they are managed in a broader ecosystem. Speaking of just shifting gears a little bit, speaking of my layers proposal, I haven't really had time to work out any additional details lately, but I would like to get some directional agreement on the basic direction. So I sent out a summary this morning of how I see my different initiatives fitting together in terms of the layers, extension mechanisms like API aggregation and initializers and emission control extension, multiple repos, feature branches, breaking out things like cloud provider, deprecation of KubeUp, and development of a stack of cluster lifecycle management tools like Kube and Kops. All those things are related in my mind, like part of a coherent direction that basically I tried to paint that picture in that email. But I think it would be helpful for people. There are actually a lot of directions I'm pushing things, whether it's moving functionality out of kube control so that it works with extensions, CRDs, API aggregation, other client, non-Go clients, and so on, or pushing things out of the main repo. And there are kind of a lot of things in flight that we're moving towards that aren't really captured very well anywhere. There were a couple others. Let me see if I actually remember to write them down in my notes. Oh yeah, and graduation of the workloads APIs into the apps API group. Yeah, anyway, I was working on a list somewhere. I forget where I put it, but in aggregate, that's going to be all those things together are going to be a pretty significant change to how things work now. So somewhere I would like to start assembling that vision so that across the entire project, people kind of know where we're headed. Because even within Google, it's clear that not everybody really understands that. And our team is growing big. We're in multiple geographies. Lots of things are moving really fast.
So I have a couple concerns. One is sort of one of the rules, old-time rules of operations is never turn more than one knob at a time because you don't know what actually improved things or made it worse. How do we one, increment these in an agile way so we're not just like, burn down the house and then try and build another one? How do we do this incrementally? And two, how do we measure efficacy of these things, and what do those benchmarks look like? How do we determine those? How do we enforce those and know if we're actually getting better?
So let me tackle the second one first, because that's another thing I've been pushing on. which is wearing my SIG contributor experience Godfather hat. I think the most critical thing we actually need is actionable metrics that we can use to manage the project. Because long past are the days where I could just look at all the outstanding issues, all the outstanding PRs, all which PRs are assigned to which person, make sure they're all getting reviewed, figure out whether everything that needs to be in the release is in the release, rip out things that shouldn't be in the release, stuff like that. So with CNCF, I've been working to, we actually had a couple of people who were working on metrics, like Antoine built Velodrome. We weren't able to sustain the effort and get it kind of pushed over to deliver everything we needed. So CNCF has a contractor, Lucas, who's working on two approaches. One is investigating whether he can simplify Velodrome to make it easier to add new metrics, because the way it built its data models, it's kind of super painful to add metrics. And we're going to pay for Sapo. So they are Kubernetes users, and they built some dashboards as demos for us for free. But one of my goals is to make it easy enough to add dashboards, ideally without coding, that we can quickly get whatever metrics we find we're lacking, right? So things like, just as one example, I watch the commit rate graph on GitHub for the Kubernetes repo on a pretty regular basis. I actually was thinking of getting some contributor experience t-shirts made that to tilt the graph up and to the right. But let me see if I can, too many windows. If people don't know what I'm talking about, is the graph here. One thing that happened in 1.7 release is we had our lowest commit rate of any release since 1.0. So is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? I don't actually know. So it would be super useful if I just had a stacked graph of all the repos that roll into a Kubernetes release, so I could see where are those commits shifting to. I believe that that is the commit rate for Kubernetes only, yes. I believe what has happened is success, that the commits have shifted into other places. But it is also true that one thing that Velodrome did do is produce graphs that show it takes longer and longer to get stuff merged for most people. Like people who are paired up so that you have someone who can review and approve your PRs for all the PRs you write, those people are fine and happy and they get stuff merged quickly, and like everybody else is screwed. And it takes longer and longer and longer. If you look at like the 80th or 90th percentile, or probably even like the 60th percentile, the median amount of time even it takes to get something merged in Kubernetes master has been monotonically increasing for almost the entire history of the project. As we add more contributors, it just takes longer and longer and longer. So those kinds of metrics, things like how many pull requests is each approver getting, or is each reviewer getting, so we can tell whether the auto assignment is working correctly or manual routing is working. That is something I used to check manually, and I no longer have any insight into that. The leaderboard issue has come up recently. Like, how do we actually identify candidates for new reviewers or approvers, or people who are proposing membership? So there was Nikita's tool, so that someone could run this tool to put together a resume to propose that they want to be a member or a reviewer, approver, or maintainer, stuff like that. We need visibility at scale, basically. And then if we had those kinds of metrics, that would enable us to be able to tell maybe not which cause and effect, but in aggregate, whether things were headed in the right direction or not. And right now, like, we can change the PR workflow, we can change labels and bot commands and owners and whatever, and we have no idea if it's making things better or worse, really, other than anecdotal evidence. So I guess, what do we do about, how do we make incremental progress, and what do we do about changing too many things at the same time? And the multi-repo thing has actually been an incremental process that has been moving. It's been happening for over a year. It's been more visible lately and made more noise, but since it was becoming harder and harder to get things into Kubernetes master, and harder to add new APIs, and harder to add new components, and we added the incubator process and things like that. New things at least have been moving to other repos for quite some time. In order to facilitate that, the API machinery had to be made available to other repos and to other GitHub orgs, which is why all the staging stuff was added. Now we're at a point where that stuff is still developed in Kubernetes master, but it's copied out into other repos so they can be more easily vendored in. Since we saw cases like Helm had to basically copy a bunch of Kubernetes API machinery and manually whack at it until it was usable in an external client. Now, hopefully, with things like Client Go and the other the non-Go client libraries that we're working on, doing that kind of stuff is much easier. We need to get to the point where we have an SDK for someone who wants to build an API. They can easily whip up an API server, generate the types, generate the client libraries, whatever they need to do. So that's kind of the goal, is to get reusable API machinery. There are other projects even that we want to be able to reuse that API machinery, not just other like aggregated APIs or non-aggregated Kubernetes Kubernetes style APIs, but some closely related projects. We're at the point where the general kind of tooling and meta programming you can do on top of a Kubernetes compatible API is a useful thing. So this is something we've actually talked about since 2014, but we're now at the point where, yeah, it'd actually be really valuable to enable people to experiment with, for example, infrastructure level APIs to make it easier to port Kubernetes, but have those be, non-aggregated APIs. Or Istio is actually considering using Kubernetes style APIs so that users can write a consistent configuration style. So yeah, I think that's where in the stack diagram, the API machinery I view as a means to an end. It's a library, right? So that's not the whole nucleus. It's just a building block for the nucleus. That stuff can be potentially moved out and just be an independent project, really. And it's not really domain specific. And then the nucleus would be the usage of that API machinery for the core of Kubernetes, which is executing pods on nodes, right? So the API server plus the kubelet is really the core of everything that Kubernetes is. And everything else is kind of built on top of that. So I think I'm done monologuing for now.
It was a really good monologue.
Next time you'll have to do it in iambic pentameter, though.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the documentation and the establishment, like for SIG Art, like getting the system diagram, getting the how the pieces relate, and trying to push through that, like, is one of the responsibilities of the SIG. Like, if there's one thing that I thought the SIG really has to do is be able to answer the question, what's the architecture of Kubernetes and how do I relate to everything else? And so, like, even though these things are coupled with everything else, like we what do we have to do to merge the things that are uncontroversial and are correct fast, and then to burn through the backlog of SIG Arc things to get to the next step. Like, that's what I worry about. Is I continually hear people ask, what is the architecture? And I think we have an effective de facto answer because we've had an architecture for 3 years. We were always afraid a little bit to say, like, this is the official architecture. But I mean, let's be honest, like the combined consensus of the long-term contributors, maintainers, and project area owners roughly parallels to what Brian has, and there'll be details that are wrong, but like, I don't know that there's anything egregious there. What can we do in the short term to get some more formalism around the architecture so that people can relate to it and see where we go from here?
We need to ratify Brian's documents. We just need to draw a line in the sand and say those documents are actually the architecture, and this is how we're moving forward.
And I think it's a good chance to test the process of there's reasonable consensus. There'll always be a small amount of wiggle stuff. Can we put the lazy consensus model to a test based on SIG architecture, the people who attend this SIG, as well as a general communication that we have done enough to make other SIGs and other people in the community and given an opportunity for feedback to happen and start like building up the momentum on a process of sucking these things into captured form.
Right. Yeah. I mean, along the lines of the architecture diagram, I think there are a couple of different views we need to create. One is the component level view. I'll paste a slide in that you've probably seen in a lot of Googler presentations. It's not 100% what I want to see in the diagram we put into the repo, but I think it's closer than the old diagram that I removed the link to, and I'm just going to delete, I think, the PNG and the SVG of the thing that shows C advisor as a component and all this kind of stuff. But and so part of my objective with the SIG is to get stuff out of my head into other people's heads. So I really need, for the things that people already might understand, like what components are part of a Kubernetes system and how they talk to each other. Like this diagram, I really would like someone else to sign up for putting pen to paper or typing it or drawing a diagram or whatever. And then I can review it and say, yeah, that reflects reality and intent, and get that checked in, both because I'm super duper time constrained, but also because, you know, it's helpful to confirm, for me to confirm the degree to which other people actually understand the direction things are going. Like I can just push things out, and then often I hear very little direct feedback, maybe because I black hole GitHub notifications, but whatever. I think I really, really, really want to broaden the participation and get more people involved and more people transfer some of that institutional knowledge.
Yeah, and I think if I were to say that I think an important goal, you know, the communication is the first goal, and the second goal is ensuring that maintainers and influencers and drivers in the Kubernetes community are aware of and can reference back to some of the captured things, but also understand how to ask questions. And like, that is the goal of the SIG. It's starting to happen. People are coming here, but we're still doing a lot of the process side versus the actual access. We need to move forward. So I don't want to volunteer because I feel like I know too much of this as well.
Yeah, I was going to say that.
I'm not a good confirmer of Brian because a lot of it's in my head as well. So I would prefer someone else stepped up.
Yeah, I think it has to be someone other than me, Clayton, or Tim, basically.
Well, what's the time frame on this? Because I'd be willing to do it, but I'm just tied up with this 1.8 release. So,
yeah, I mean, you don't have to do everything either. And if this SIG is going to be successful, it has to be more than like 2 or 3 people.
Yeah, acknowledged.
Otherwise, it's like a total waste of my time, and my time would be better spent just spewing out docs. Right.
Well, can I ask you an odd question, Brian?
Yeah.
Does anybody oppose you on this? Do you have an arch enemy or an arch rival that like has a totally different vision about architecture than you, or are you sort of Like do you have a volcano lab somewhere that you just come up with this stuff?
Well, Joe's not here, so I'll pick on Joe.
Okay. Why did I know you were going to say that?
Joe has come around on some things, like multiple repos. Yeah, I'd say Joe heckles me more than anybody.
And I think the challenge is that a lot of those discussions happen in side channels or in specific issues. And part of the goal for this was to start surfacing the decision and discussion process to where either we agree to disagree, whether we identify who's going to go really chase it down and take ownership for understanding the difference between the 2 or 3 or 4 positions. Brandon's got one, API evolution has been one, like we talked about labels. And labels is actually a really thorny problem. It's very difficult to establish the stake in the ground once some consensus has been reached, such that other people can benefit from it. And I think like Brian spewing out the docs is useful. Someone expressing some form of someone who is acted as an opposition force or a point of disagreement or whatever to any position, doesn't even matter. Like I disagree with Brian on things like he's crazy and wants to go remove conditions. Getting that process of discussion happening in a form that is consumable by other people is the singular failing of this project in terms of at the scale we're at, we can't afford not to have a way to thread that. So.
Yeah, thanks for posting those examples to the issue, by the way.
And in a lot of these discussions, there actually are concrete examples. If the SIG, so maybe like not Brian and not me to some degree, although I should do more of it, creating docs that capture a position.
Yeah, this is something that's complained, like some of the marathon issues where discussion happened, way beyond sent to thread, like kilothread issues that went on for years, and then we closed them with no summary of what happened.
And the comment is, we already decided this in this thread. Here's 7,000 issues or 7,000 comments on it, and GitHub won't load it correctly anymore because.
Yeah, what's the deal with that anyway?
So I would say rubber stamping, Brian, having some point of comment feedback to make sure that the rubber stamping is actually things that no one fundamentally disagrees with. I think maybe the argument is that participation in SIG Arc to some degree requires the time allotment to burn through the backlog and to offer meaningful feedback. And we need to figure out a way to because we don't really have a maintainer of SIG Arc stuff, whereas for the code repos, we'd say, your responsibility is to review all of the PRs that come through this process. We're actually lacking that today in a lot of the process stuff, is that no one is actually required in order to be seen as participating to go through that process.
Yeah, so one thing I will want for the SIG is to decide who the approvers are. And then, like with every other part of the project, we'll want to expand that over time. Just as an example, we do have kind of an official notion of API approver. It's kind of cross-cutting across all the code, but that is a small set of people who've done a lot of API reviews, who participated in the development of the API conventions and enforcement of them over the years. So we just officially added somebody who should have been added a long time ago to that group, Jordan Liggett. I view that as kind of under the umbrella of SIG architecture as well, although Jordan's not here. And Tim and Eric are not here. But, there is kind of a de facto set of people who make those kind of decisions. Similarly, for architecture, I'll probably start small with the people who basically created the architecture that exists, and that's basically me, Clayton, and Tim. And then we can decide how to expand that going forward. But as we get these formalize some of these de facto processes, I think that will help. But I would like to start. I think one way method of attack for SIG architecture is to start high level and get basic direction approved, and then we can iterate on fleshing out the detail. Because if we block on all the detail, I think we're not going to make a lot of progress. So that's where, having the component level program view checked in, and then maybe some simple text with an outline. Yes, my notification page actually, it caused a GitHub outage. Is that serious?
Yeah, it was actually correlated. Somebody confirmed it.
Yeah, and for a long time it pulls up the pink unicorn, but I didn't realize it actually took them down. Yeah, so if people notify me, I can't even search for notifications on GitHub. Yeah, so anyway, and we're about 3/4 of the way through our time.
So Brian,
yeah.
This is Matt Farina. I was just going to say, because you're looking for help in this. So in a number of ways, I'm not sure how much I can engage at the moment on it. But if you start at the top and work into more detail, I'm happy to be a sounding board or engage in that if you're looking for somebody from the outside. At least if something, because you've got it in your head, it's harder to communicate it to people who don't know. I'm happy to be involved in that.
Oh, great. Thanks. So I'm going to pick on you for stepping forward. Do you think you can put together a component level view of the system similar to the link I dropped into chat and capture that in a PNG or something that we could check in the repo?
Sure. It'll be a few days, but yeah.
Sure. A few days is fine. I mean, it's been a lingering issue for years. So
sure. I can do that.
Cool. Something with color would be good. I didn't really like the black and white thing that we had before.
No, I can do something with color. That's no problem.
We don't really have a standard tool or form. Some things are just PNGs that people created using, I don't know what tools, maybe Google Drawings or something, and some things are SVGs. I don't really have a strong opinion. I can't really recommend a tool.
I've done enough diagrams over time that I'll come up with something that has a nice output that can be embedded at the same time. We'll have the source to alter later.
Cool. Good enough. And just to circle back on action items, Caleb, you said you would break out the template into a separate PR?
Yep.
Cool. Clayton, I think it was before you arrived, I want to reassign the categorization of design proposals if you haven't already done it.
I mean, I was about to, but if you want to reassign it to someone else, I'm happy to let someone else do it.
Can we get another volunteer to do that?
Wasn't Garrison volunteering to do it, or Garrett volunteering?
I don't know what thread that was.
I don't remember who it was.
Bueller. All right. Well, if we can't get another volunteer, how soon do you think you can get to it?
I was going to look at it tomorrow. I mean, admittedly, with Code Freeze coming up, I'm getting slammed with approvals, which is the only reason I hadn't really touched it this week.
Yeah, thanks for picking up the slack on that. I've been distracted by other things.
I think everybody's somewhat distracted this release. Hopefully we don't get a huge surge of approvals on Friday. We've actually had a big surge this week, so we're doing something right on the release side.
I've been pounding the pavement at every SIG I can go to try and get people working on this stuff. So Caleb's been doing the same thing.
So even though it's more of a sort of a contributor experience-ish thing, it's related to the communication protocol for proposals. How do people feel about all the GitHub teams? And every project I've been on has had multiple mailing lists to segregate like bugs from discussion from design proposals. Seems like, and that's been true of multiple projects, multiple companies. It seems like a fairly standard thing, but I don't see it used super consistently. Is it too much bureaucracy? And for the people like Jace or me or Clayton or Brandon who are trying to keep track of things in multiple SIGs, it's pretty much impossible without some kind of way to filter stuff.
it is interesting because the bot integration, I feel like I've noticed people doing the correct thing, which is the bot gives them the warning about not being assigned to a SIG. And I have seen people mention, I don't know that it's totally clear that people know how to map to SIGs, but
mapping to SIG seems to be a lesser problem than mapping to the correct, categorizing what kind of thing it is.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people just pick one of those, which in practice for non-overwhelmed contributors does end up being fairly effective.
Yeah, I mean, most people pick MISC. Which,
at the end of the day, as long as again, like some of this is like ad hoc human at small scales. As long as someone gets the notification, it's reasonable. It's more the overwhelmed volume ones that tend to be a little picky about which group it is. I'm seeing it used, and I see people using it to coordinate. I don't know that it's, like, anecdotally, it's at least 25% or 30% of contributors use that to get attention. I do see a lot of people abusing the assign mechanics.
Yes, they like assign 10 people.
One thing I've noticed, though, is that a lot of the GitHub teams across any particular SIG is like an 80% coverage of the same people across all the teams. So I don't know if SIGs are being super selective about who gets added to the various parts of the team. Like, it'll be the same 10 people across the board, and then 2 people will be different per thing.
But that's fine if one of those people is me, right? Like, that's working as intended if I can actually pay attention to proposals and ignore bugs, right?
Fair enough. Yeah, good point.
Yeah, sorry. So I would suggest to work a bit on the documentation to describe what is the purpose of every team, because this question has been raised multiple times. I agree that we really need these teams, but the biggest concern from multiple people that they don't really understand why do we need these teams and why they simply can't use the single team for that. So yeah, it has to be simply documented, and I would also add requirement. When you're creating a new team, you have to add a few lines about like a description to the team on GitHub. So any person who is looking up for this team can understand what is the major purpose of this team.
Well, just to give people an idea of the direction I would like to go is Joe Bita at some point had volunteered to develop a tool to sync from a YAML file to GitHub. That's the direction I would like to go, is to actually manage the membership of all the teams and files, and then we could write a description there and sync that to the GitHub description. Because GitHub, as in most things, doesn't provide great mechanisms for managing those things, and nobody can audit why people were added to teams or when people were added or removed and who did that and things like that, unless you're an owner of the org. I agree about the documentation, and there have been questions about what are these teams for, and it seems mostly pretty obvious. Is that something you could take a stab at, Ivor? Is fleshing out the documentation for that?
Yeah, I'd like to.
Okay, great. What do you think about eliminating the MISC teams, and instead, now that GitHub supports nesting, we could have an umbrella team or something like that?
Yeah, I've been thinking about that, but I don't remember. We probably may have some limitations by GitHub. As far as I remember, somebody has raised this concern as well, but I don't exactly remember what other concerns were, unfortunately, for now. So we'll take a look, and we'll figure out if umbrella teams and the tree structure will work for us.
Okay, and otherwise, we could rename all the MISC teams the way I did to some of them and say use only as last resort or something like that.
Yeah.
Like, I don't care if the MISC team is notified in addition to the other teams, really, I guess, because I could just unsubscribe from all the MISC teams. But if that's the only team that's notified, which is what I usually see, then it's not super, it might as well not notify anybody.
Yeah, I agree.
Having a group team also, it smooths the initial thing, like having the mapping between a SIG and a general purpose group, and then ensuring that some things can get escalated is a generally good pattern. Like the I don't know what I'm doing, I know what I'm doing I know what I'm doing, having value for other people who are working, like is probably works better than just people use MISC because it looks like I don't know.
Right. Okay. So anyway, we're about out of time. We have at least some things people volunteered to do, so thank you for that. Hopefully we can make a little progress over the next week.
One thing, now that we're done, or before you get off, another thing that could happen is maybe we need to start tying the Munger labels more closely into mention lists, which is
that's what Michelle suggested.
Yeah, exactly. Like API change should notify the SIGs API group automatically.
I like that. The direction we started with was if you notify, we'll automatically add the labels for you.
Yep, exactly.
People find the bot commands more intuitive.
Well, and the bot goes and identifies things by code as we split out more of we don't have a formal process in place for a ton of things other than code review, code approval, and API review. As we develop more of those, tying those to groups in a strong fashion so that it's a unified, consistent thing might help.
Yeah. Okay. Does anybody else have anything?
Nope. Actually, I did have one thing that I'll put in the backlog, but essentially we need to determine, I'm writing up a proposal on this, but for outside projects, what is the graduation / admission criteria for release blocking and merge blocking tests for external projects? Because as these develop, there's going to be a tendency to want to have everybody put their thing in as merge blocking or release blocking. We need to find a way to sort that out.
Well, yeah, and so one thing you might be able to infer from the email I sent out this morning is I think we're going to have fewer things blocking the release of the core bits and integrating all the things is going to be a downstream activity.
That is as I would hope. So the road between there and here is where I guess what we'll talk about in the meantime. So.
Yeah, so are those getting discussed at SIG testing or SIG release or where?
Hopefully SIG release and SIG testing. But I'm going to write up something and I'll distribute it. And I think that yours is the target point, right? That's branching and all that.
Yeah, I mean, the current reality is the .0 it never works. It's basically a release candidate because everything comes together at the last minute. People flip, vendor in big changes or change which dependent component we're using or whatever it is. We always find out seemingly at the last minute.
Yeah.
And we can't get people to try, if we're shipping a new beta release every single day leading up to the .0, we're not going to get anybody to try those and give us any significant usage or feedback or canary. So until we change something major about how we do development, the .0 is never going to work.
Okay. Yeah, agreed.
And we need to try to make it work every single time, or it's really going to be doomed. But I really think getting the core development out of the main repo is the only way we're going to be able to make it stable. Node.js has been in the news for not great things lately, but they have a model where stuff that hits the development branch doesn't automatically go into any release. They also have much higher test coverage. There was the good article by Daniel Vetter about the Linux model. I think going 100% that way isn't going to work for us. We can't pay 10 people to just full-time merge branches together. But we do need to have some branch that's relatively stable, that we can vet, the features are fully baked, tested, documented, etc., before we cut the release from that branch.
Yeah, agreed. Well, that's it for time. Brian, thanks for all your work on this, and thanks everybody else for attending, especially given the meeting time change. So office hours in exactly 1 week from today, and we'll see you then, hopefully.
Okay, great. Yeah, if you have agenda items, we have an agenda doc, do we?
We do, yeah, and I've been taking notes in there, and also we have the architectural backlog that's in the GitHub repository, so that's also linked.
Yeah, so if you do have something you want to discuss during office hours, please try to send it and put it on the agenda yourself, so we can prep for that before the meeting. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.